everyone, this is Anna from Expat Realty, and today I'm going to talk to you about common misconceptions and mistakes that people make when moving to Portugal. So for those of you who don't know, Expat Realty is a relocation and investment agency that supports expats who are looking to relocate to Portugal. We work with those purchase and rentals, and we work in the whole country from a buyer's perspective. We always defend the buyers and tenants' interests, and we work with lifestyle. If you would like to know a bit more about our company, feel free to visit our website in www.savvycatrealty.com, where you are able to find a lot of information and also a free workbook to plan your life to Portugal. So, about today's topic, common mistakes and misconceptions when moving to Portugal. So, I think the biggest one that comes up most often is timelines. And this is one that I talk about a lot and comes out a lot in a lot of situations around this business, because in a lot of countries, and especially with Americans, people are used for services to be very fast and efficient. Well, that's not the case in Portugal. In private and public services, unfortunately, our services tend to be rather not so well prepared, I would say, and for us Portuguese people, it is actually extremely normal to wait 1 to 2 weeks for a reply on something, on an email or something. And when I started working with Americans, I know this was my norm, and people would go crazy if I didn't reply to them for like 2 or 3 days. And I realized that was a huge cultural clash, because that's not how things work in Portugal. I very fast learned that, I learned very quickly that, well, I needed to adapt. So my service was created to try and keep up with international reply times and service standards. So we do our best to reply quickly to everyone, but you will not experience that in most of Portuguese services, and everything takes a very, very long time to get done, especially with public services where it is often to wait months to get anything done. So, mistake number 1, expecting everything to be quickly. You really need to learn calmness and patience to move to Portugal. So that is the first thing to really think about when you are moving to Portugal and considering your options. Are you willing to deal with very slow services? Because that's what you'll be finding in most cases. So, the next very big misconception and culture clash tends to be the real estate market and the way that it works. In rentals, you don't feel it as much, but for purchases, a lot of people that come to a lot of clients and people that come from very regulated markets, they feel a huge clash when they come to Portugal, because the real estate market here is kind of the Wild West. It is very under-regulated and things are a bit all over the place. You will see a lot of ads that don't correspond to reality. You will see properties whose address doesn't match. You will see the same property being listed at different prices in different agencies. You will see illegal property being sold by professional agencies. So it's really all over the place, and especially I would say that the buyer side is very underrepresented, because the standard practice is for the seller to be represented and then the buyer either to get their own representation or to just have their own lawyers or something. So even when you are looking through an agency, it is fairly hard to find someone that is just on the buyer side. And thankfully more services like that are appearing, and of course my service is one of those. We are designed to support the buyer. but this is something very new on the market, and the market is not very functional in a lot of ways. So it is really important to be cautious and to do your research and really have someone on your side, whether it's a company like mine or a lawyer. Really have someone who knows what they're doing, because just a friend, as well intended as they might be, they may get you in a lot more trouble than it's worth it. So do be careful with those situations with the real estate market, and do not expect things to work the way that they work in your own country. And this is, of course, very common. It's the base of cultural clash, isn't it? You come from somewhere and you are used that things operate in a certain way, and some things are just seem obvious to you, and I know that happens to everyone. Some things that I think were the same everywhere, and turns out they weren't. And sometimes that happens, and the real estate market is definitely one of those examples. So be very careful when you are looking to purchase a property in Portugal, because it's very likely that things work very differently than your own country. And that brings us to the third topic, which is in following and with this one, which is don't compare things on your own country to Portugal. And one of those things is pricing. And this very much tends to happen on the high end, which means people come from higher markets like, you know, Britain and US and Germany and so on. And they come to certain locations and they find property to be very affordable in comparison to their own countries. But that doesn't mean that that property is well priced within our own market. And once again, because of the way that things are set up here in Portugal and the lack of regulation, it is very easy for people to be tricked into buying things a bit more expensive than they should be buying, because they don't have proper buying representation. Of course, this is very much a supply and demand issue. The more demand there is, the less the negotiation will be. And as long as there's people willing to pay, the prices will go up. And of course, you've been experienced that everywhere. But I do think that the lack of regulation in the Portuguese market and the lack of buyer representation has led to a much more steep increase in prices in a lot of locations. And it is very easy to note that in the more touristic demanded locations like Lisbon and the Algarve, where the difference in prices is just very, very obvious. So although this issue at the moment is a bit harder to tackle because it's very much a supply and demand thing, it is once again very important to make sure you have all the information before you make a decision, and you make an informed decision without just using your own home country as base of reference. Another thing that I think people have a lot of issues when especially people who are looking to relocate to Portugal to actually live in, because when it's just for holiday houses and so on, it's okay to be a touristy spot. It's supposed to be a touristy spot probably. And when it's to actually move here to live on the long term, you do need to make a bit more of an investigation and a bit of a deeper investigation, because some people, they come to Portugal on a vacation for a week or two and they fall in love with, let's say, Lisbon or the Algarve or something, but they only experience the very small part of these locations, and they have a very touristy view of these locations that may not correspond to the actual reality of living here long term. So one of the things that I think it's important is to make sure and just touch base to make sure that your expectations and your needs are aligned with the location you are looking at. And if you don't have a misconception directed from a touristy idea that in the end may not correspond to the reality you are looking for. So that is something that I definitely think people should pay a lot more attention than they do sometimes. Which leads us to the next thing, which once again comes on the series of topics we've been discussing here, and it's once again on the same theme, which is thinking that Portugal is cheap. Portugal used to be cheap, and Portugal is cheap compared to other more developed economies like the UK and the US and Germany and so on. However, from the internal living perspective, Portugal is not cheap at all. So if you compare the cost of living with the wages here, Portugal is an extremely expensive country. However, if you compare the cost of living with the wages in Europe or in the US, then Portugal is an extremely affordable country. And that's why Portugal is becoming extremely popular for people to come live in with foreign sources of income, because you can definitely have a very good quality of life here. You have a lot of great advantages, you know, like climate, quality of the food, diversity of the food, safety, architecture. Overall, Portugal is extremely welcoming, so it's a really nice place to live in if you have a foreign income. However, the internal economy is not nearly as stable and as well developed as it should be, and it is definitely not a country where you can expect to have a great quality of life and with a local job. That is not something easy to achieve, as the minimum wage versus the cost of living is extremely disproportional in a bad way. So that is definitely something to consider. And also from an international perspective, it very much depends on where you're coming from, because Portugal is not that cheap. It is not that expensive either from an international perspective. But once again, it will be comparing to the place you are coming from. If you are coming from a much higher economy, then yes, it will be cheap. If you're coming from a more average economy, then it probably won't be that much of a difference, and the advantages will be more on the quality of life side of things. So you really need to investigate and make sure you know what you are coming to. Another common misconception is the language barrier. So, of course, Portugal is one of the highest proficiency of English countries in the world. I think it's 6th or 7th. So you can definitely live in Portugal without speaking Portuguese, and it will mostly be easy, and most people will understand you, especially on the big cities. But I do definitely think that you should learn a bit of the language of the country you are moving into, because in case of emergency and, for example, with services or even in a hospital emergency that you don't speak the local language and the local doctors and nurses may not speak English, you will find yourself in a very limited situation. And this, of course, is a risk of anyone moving to a country with a different language. But I just want to leave a note here that although Portugal does have a very good English proficiency, and in big cities it's easy to live without speaking Portuguese, it's definitely important to have at least a basic understanding of the language, because the language in the country is still Portuguese, and you may find yourself in a position where you don't have an alternative other than speaking the local language, even though that may not be the most common situation. So do think about that when you are considering moving to a different country. Another thing that it's very common to happen when people are moving to Portugal from a different country, especially from overseas, is that they want to bring their house with them. Well, this may not be the best idea, especially if you're coming from overseas, because the cost of transport and the cost and the time of transport and the headaches of transport, it will be very, very time consuming. And you should probably declutter. You should probably look at the things that are truly important and you want to bring and what is worth it to bring or not, because the cost of overseas, usually container transportation, is going to be high and some items may not be worth it. Same thing for vehicles. It tends not to be worth it to bring vehicles from outside of Europe. From inside of Europe, it tends to be worth it though. And same thing, so from inside of Europe, the transportation may be a bit easier, but if you are bringing everything by car, depending if it's yourself or a company, it will also be a very hard and time-consuming task in general. So do look into your belongings and what it is that you truly want to bring and what is not that important that maybe can stay at home. And plan accordingly, because it may save you a lot of time and headaches. And sometimes it's nice to start over. I guess it depends on your situation, but if you are coming to a different country, maybe it's nice to have a different setup too. Another thing that happens often is that public transportation in Portugal, although it's better than in some other countries, it's not exactly exemplar. And for example, in Lisbon, you definitely are able to use public transportation to go anywhere and live without a car very comfortably. Same thing in the center of Porto and in more central locations. But if you want to be more in the suburbs or depending on the location, you probably cannot rely on public transportation, because outside of the big cities, public transportation does tend to be quite limited. So if you want to live without having a car, you do really have to plan accordingly, because a lot of places won't work without having a car. So, and of course it is a two-way choice, meaning that if you want to be in a more central location, it's probably going to be more expensive, but then you don't have to invest in a car. But if you want to be more in the suburbs, it may not work, depending on the location it is and the availability of public transportation, which once again, outside of the metropolitan areas, tends to be very, very limited. And even in certain metropolitan areas, it may be limited, like Porto and Lisbon are fairly okay, but other cities, it's very much on a case-by-case scenario, whether or not it is possible to live without a car. And just to close this up, I think that one of the most important things that you really need to figure out before deciding to move to a different country is why you are moving to a different country. And it's definitely a very big mistake to make that change without having that figure out. Your reason can be anything, and it's perfectly valid, whatever it is. It can be for your kids to be have better education. It can be because you want to be safer. It can be because you want your money to stretch further. It can be because you just want a change of pace and a change of landscape. But you really need to know the why, so you don't get disappointed once you are here, or you don't get lost. Because when people are kind of like, oh, I'd like to have a better life, but they can't really pinpoint exactly what they want to change, they tend to just go around in circles without really figuring out how to solve things or even making a final decision, because they don't have their why figured out. So definitely that's one of the biggest things to need to have figured out, and it's a big problem if you make this kind of big change without having your why figured out. So I think this gives you a pretty big overview of things to consider when moving to a different country, in this case specifically Portugal, but many of the things apply if you are considering other countries too. And I hope this was helpful. I would love to hear your feedback. We do release videos every week with useful information about relocating to Portugal and what's happening here, and renovations, purchases, and everything you may need around this topic. We are always open to feedback. If you do need to contact us, feel free to reach out at contact@savvycatrealty.com. And you can also check our website at www.savvycatrealty.com. Once again, I hope this was helpful, and I hope to see you all next week.